Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for attending the Canadian Association of African Studies Professional Development webinar. And this particular webinar, as I'm sure you are aware, is on publications. First of all, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Canadian Association of African Studies, CAAS for short, it is a community of Africanists brought together by common goals and sustained by the networks of our diverse scholarly activities and the kinds of communities we support and the work that we do with those communities. The association hosts, for instance, an annual conference at different Canadian university campuses each year. The conferences bring together academic researchers, specialists on Africa, and research centers. The conference also attracts non-academics whose work focus on Africa and its diasporas. The conferences attach importance to ensuring the participation and support of graduate students from Canadian and African universities. Our 2024 conference this year, will be held in Montreal at McGill University as part of Congress from June 12th to June 16th. Second, we, that is the executive of the Canadian Association of African Studies, me not included, but taking some of the glory, have envisioned the 2023-2024 webinars as a conversation starter, as a way to share advice, resources, and build community by bringing together scholars and practitioners across Canada and outside of Canada, and also catalyze mentorship opportunities. This is the third of 4 webinars we have planned for the 2023-2024 academic year. Our next webinar will take place on March 1st and will focus on leadership in academia. Finally, would like to say a special thank you to Femi Ajedahun for advertising the event, and he's here as our technical support person, and a great shout out to Sumin for developing the art for the event. I would also like to say a very special thank you and introduce, for instance, and especially the president of the Canadian Association for African Studies, who is here in our midst, Dr. Grace Adeniyi Ogunyankin. Hi. So my name is Sylvia Bauer. I'm an associate professor at York University in sociology, and I do work on globalization, post-colonial feminisms, and a bunch of other things. I also do editorial work for 2 journals, and that may feature very well in this discussion on publications. I would like to go ahead now to introduce each of our panelists for this particular webinar. And the webinar is going to proceed as follows. So we are going to have 3 major sessions in the webinar. The first one is manuscript subscription, and each panelist will speak for about 4 minutes, and then we move on to the next panelist and so on for that session. So manuscript submission is the first thing we're going to tackle. Next, we will discuss article review processes, again for another 20 minutes using the same format. And then we will go to the last section on article submission and publication, which is the last segment. After that, we will answer all of your questions for the next 30 minutes after all of that. But in the meantime, if you have questions while the panelists are speaking, please feel free to write in the chat. We'll try to keep track of those questions and ask them during the Q&A. I'll now introduce to you each of the panelists in no particular order. Ambrina Manji is the Dean of International for Africa and a Professor of Land Law and Development at Cardiff University. She's also a co-editor of African Affairs and currently serves as an editorial board member of Social and Legal Studies, an international journal. Her research focuses on African law and society. It's strongly interdisciplinary and includes work on law in Africa, in African literature, African history, legal education, and women and law. Next, Kajetan Iheka is a professor of English at Yale University, specializing in African literature, eco-criticism, eco-media, and environmental humanities. He is the editor-in-chief of African Studies Review, the multidisciplinary journal of the African Studies Association. Next, Dr. Belinda Dodson is a human geographer with research interests in gender, migration, and development. Her regional specialization is Southern Africa, where she grew up. Educated in South Africa and the UK, she moved to Canada in 1997. Now based in Ottawa, she's an adjunct professor at both Western University and Carleton's Institute of African Studies. She serves as coordinating editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies. Finally, Carly Kudzia is the editor of the Journal of African Cultural Studies and the founder of the Journal Work Academy, a collaboration between the African Studies Association of the UK, ASA UK, and the African Studies Association of Africa, ASAA. She is the chair of the Lagos Studies Association, LSA, Lagos Studies Association's Publications Committee, and in cooperation with the LSA, runs regular writing workshops at their annual conference. She's the current president of the African Studies Association of the UK, ASUK, and has published scholarly articles on knowledge ecologies and on Journal of Work as Labor and as Practice. Welcome to all of you for taking your time out on this afternoon to join us and to provide us with support and resources. We'll be jumping right into the conversations. I would also just like to acknowledge the presence of some of the executives of the Canadian Association of African Studies who are in our midst. I will not go through your names, but you know yourself, just to say hello and thank you for all the work behind the scenes in making this possible. So I will start by, in the order in which I introduce panelists for your 5-minute take on the following question. So could you briefly discuss the scope of the journal that you edit, the submission process, and the types of submissions that you are interested in your journal? And I'll be starting with Ambrina.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and many thanks indeed to all colleagues for the immense work that goes into putting something like this together. And it's great to see such a good number of attendees this evening. So I'll speak about the journal that I currently edit, African Affairs, and tell you a little bit about its scope. And this is an exceptionally important question, actually, because one of the major reasons for rejections, particularly desk rejections, which means a rejection of a paper before it's actually gone out to reviewers, that is a rejection by the editors on their first reading of the paper. One of the main reasons for that rejection on our journal is because the paper falls outside the scope of the journal. That's really important. What we're finding is that authors aren't aware of the aims and scope of African Affairs and haven't necessarily become accustomed to doing the work to make themselves familiar with the journal to which they're submitting. So African Affairs is largely seen as a journal of political science and international relations, but that is in the most broadly conceivable sense. So we have been known to publish papers which are reasonably historical in perspective. We have been known to publish papers which actually, when you read them, don't necessarily have a huge political science, international relations bent. So, I mean, I'm a very good example of that. I published in the journal a few years ago, and I wouldn't describe the paper I published as necessarily hugely political sciencey, partly because I'm a lawyer. But there was clearly enough content of that sort to persuade the editors at the time that it was worth a go. And it went out to review, and it went through various really quite major revisions and then was published. So I would emphasize a few things for authors who are considering our journal, but this is true of any journal that you might be considering. Do your background work, because it's really wasteful of your time, and it's I think sets authors back in terms of their kind of faith and optimism about their paper, if they get a rejection simply because their paper doesn't fit. So you need to do the kind of work that assures you that the journal you're submitting to is a good fit for you. So ask yourself various questions. I mean, the first and the easiest thing to do is to go to, if you have a hard copy or if you're able to go online, check what the journal says about itself. How does it describe itself? Look at its aims and scopes, its description of itself, and think, does that fit with the kind of paper I'm working on? Or can I make my paper speak to that kind of aims and scope? But also take some time to perhaps read papers that are published in that journal and say to yourself, am I able to persuade the editors and the reviewers that I'm making a contribution to a debate that's already current in the journal? And if not, because of course we do publish papers which are really breaking new ground, which are on topics which we've never published on before, you need to say that explicitly. African Affairs has never been known to make an intervention in this field, but here I am offering my astounding intervention. But you need to speak to that very point. You need to say to the reviewers and to the editors, my paper fits. You need to communicate that to them quite strongly, because there is really nothing worse than that kind of rejection at the stage of submission, as a desk rejection. If your paper fits and it goes through to reviewers, then it's also the case that reviewers can say, well, look, actually there isn't a great fit here with the journal, but actually they're much more likely to say, here's a way that the authors could be advised to bring it into a fit. What you want to avoid is the desk rejection. And in order to do that, I would really say invest your time upfront in finding out what journal it is you're targeting and what its traditions, its ethos, its debates are, and see whether you can show that you're contributing to or somehow intervening in those debates. Or if you're making a very new contribution, show the editors and the reviewers why that intervention is so vital and why the journal has fallen short by neglecting this interesting area of work that you're offering. So engage very directly with the journal. Don't fall into the trap of writing a paper and then thinking, oh, what's the leading journal in African studies? I'll just send it to them. That's not doing sufficient work to ensure that your paper will find the right home. Because from our perspective, we want to make sure that your paper gets the best readership it possibly can. Yeah. And one of the things we will do is we will say to an author, this is a great paper. We're not rejecting it because of its quality. We're rejecting it because it doesn't fit. And you are much more likely to find a good home for your paper with a literary studies journal, with a history journal, etc. That's much more likely to resonate with a readership. So take your paper perhaps to, we will often also name journals that they might consider.
Yeah, and that's often very helpful, I find, when you are able to even name a paper, I mean, another journal that they could go to. That is often not the case. Sometimes the rejection is very, very summary. So now for someone to speak about the same thing, but for the African Studies Review, I'll go to Kajetan now.
All right, thank you so much, Sylvia, for moderating, and to Grace and the leadership of the association for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of it. It's a pleasure to be with distinguished colleagues here. So the African Studies Review is the journal of ASA in the US, the African Studies Association of the United States. And as you can imagine, the ASA conference, hosts about 2,000 people every year, come from discipline from agriculture to zoology. So the range of work published in the journal, is just, is really broad. I'm thinking of the last few issues, we had a paper on music and COVID-19, music produced on COVID-19. We had a paper on, the military, the politicization of the Ghanaian military. So Ghanaian military in politics in Ghana. There was a paper on the ways that Ghanaians, especially young people, responded to Black Power in the 1960s. And then, coming out, a paper that, finalizing right now is a paper on African literature, an intersection with world literature. So the idea, I'm giving these examples to say that our scope is broad. What we say to authors, or you see on our website, is that a paper that we publish has to appeal to a broad Africanist audience. The appeal to a broad Africanist audience, is really, that is invitation that we give to our authors to think about. If I'm writing, I work on African literature. There's a difference between the paper I will send to ASR and the paper I will send to Research in African Literatures, published out of Indiana University Press. I do work on environmental humanities. A paper that I will send to ASR, a paper that will be compelling for ASR will be a paper that shows how, say, now the literature I'm looking at or the film is contributing to broader ecological discourses in Africa. If I can pitch my paper to a broader, conversation in African studies, I think, there is a great chance that you'll find a home in the journal. So we recently published a paper on gender. We recently published a paper on, on gender in Nigeria, and it's more specifically the male victims of, of extreme violence, extremism in northern Nigeria. So Boko Haram, the male, victims of sexual violence. It's an area that we don't talk much about. There's much conversation on the women. But even when the paper came in, the scope, it was just so limiting, But I think part of what we had to tell the author to do before we sent it out is, how does this inform the broader debate on the male sexual violence against men in Africa? So it's important then to think of, is this paper appealing to a broader audience? If it's not, then it's not for us. It should go to a more specific journal in the field. And with that situation where we say, yes, this paper should go to a journal in econ or in development or whatever field. So I think, so really thinking of ways in which, the paper is contributing to a broader debate is important. The other point I just want to come back to and emphasize is something Ambrina already said, which is, please read the journal. Read, we sometimes get a paper and we've published one or two things related to that paper in the past 2-3 years. And this will definitely enrich the paper's work. And it will also show that this is part of a conversation happening in the journal, as Ambrina was pointing to. But because you've not done that work of reading it, it doesn't help you to situate your work properly. So I think, part of reading it is also that you begin to get a sense of the temperament, the critical temperament of the author, of the editors. You see the kind of things that interest them, the kind of things they want to see. So I think that's really important. So that's something to. So pitching, thinking of how does this contribute to a broad Africanist audience? What would somebody not working in my particular field, would they find this interesting? Those are the kind of papers that tend to succeed in ASR. And of course, to look at what has been published most recently, engage them if needed, because we often draw on recently published authors as peer reviewers. So it's helpful if their work is engaging with what you're doing with, and you're not talking to them. It doesn't send the right signal, I think, when you both to the editors, but also to the peer reviewer who is taking the time to review the work. So I think, so those are the 2 points that I want to emphasize. The other reason why appealing more broadly works for us is that, unlike some journals where you have 1 or 2 editors, so we operate as a collective, editorial collective. There are 10 editors, so I lead a team of 10 editors. And they are spread, in terms of discipline, from history to anthropology to development and economics and all that. And when we receive a submission, So I look at it. If it's very obvious it's not us, I reject it. But I'll come back to this later. But the point I'm trying to make is that these other 9 editors will weigh in for every submission we receive. And then, so if you can't speak to them, even though they're not working in your field, then there's the odds of sending the paper out is very, very low.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider. The fact that how can you write in a way where the significance of your work beyond that narrow discipline is emphasized. So those are the things that I want to highlight here. Thank you. Yeah, I'll use the floor. I'll come back.
Yeah, and I like the consistency of the message. Know your audience so that you craft your article and the letter to the editors to be very specific to the journal that you are sending to. And from the perspective of the Canadian Journal of African Studies, Belinda, could you add a thing or two about this process in terms of the scope of your work and perhaps also a little bit on how authors can ensure that their work fits within the scope of a particular journal too. Thanks. No, I can't hear you. No. So we've been, Belinda, for some reason, is having some technical difficulties with her audio. And so I'll come back to you, Belinda, while you try to sort this out. And I will go straight away to Carly. Carly, if you could please weigh in on the question. I'll come back to Belinda after you to see if the issue has been resolved.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. And I also want to say thank you to all the many people in the audience. I see many names that I recognize. And I've written a message to one of my authors to ask if I can refer to your work. I've not had a response. So can my authors please read the message to see I'm about to speak about one of you. So the journal that I edit is not a journal that would typically publish me. Because the work I do doesn't really fit very well in my own journal. So, okay, my author says yes. So some of the top scholars in literary studies have submitted to the journal, and we just don't make it through the peer review because the journal doesn't publish literature, no matter who you are, how brilliant your argument is. So that's kind of something to know. You need to know the journal doesn't publish on a particular topic. What the journal I edit does publish, we like to publish work that does three things: a historical context, a contemporary angle that shows you've walked the streets, that you're not just sitting in a library doing armchair research. And the third thing is there has to be an African language angle. The language archive is a lens. So one of my authors is in the audience. Jide Salau has recently published what is a kind of signature article for the journal that I edit. It's an article on Yoruba book clubs. And what he does, he has a historical overview section. He has a really fascinating contemporary archive, and he uses Yoruba language as a lens to understand something about the topic that he's analyzing. So if you want to see a kind of signature article, go and read that one. And as my panelists have said, please do not submit to a journal unless you've read 10, 12, 20 articles from the journal. Approach it as a kind of piece of detective work. You're trying to sound like you've already been published. You're trying to have family features that make you look like you're someone who should be in a particular journal. Some time ago, I wrote an article for a particular journal who didn't publish it. And I had to spend 3 months rewriting it for a different journal because that journal, it's the same ideas, but the journal has a very different vision. So I think I'll just stop there because my colleagues have said everything.
Thank you so much, Carly, for that emphasis and also for providing the example that people can see. And I do find that a lot of journals, or almost all journals, do this. Sometimes they have a list of most read articles in their journal, And so sometimes that's a very quick and easy way to get through to seeing, okay, what is acceptable in this journal, or what are people publishing and how are they doing this publication. I don't know if Belinda, you can now speak. It would be a shame if the audio issue is not resolved, because the Canadian Journal of African Studies is the flagship journal for the Canadian Association of African Studies. So we don't have our own in-house host, or we do have her, but we may not be able to hear her because of the technical difficulty. So Belinda, could we try again? Or Belinda may be restarting her device, I think, to join us. So when she comes, whenever she's able to join us again, we'll get through it. But I think the same message goes for the Canadian Journal of African Studies. I have published there myself, and I did go through that process of reading through some of the journal articles just to see how things were framed, in that particular journal. We'll move on to the next section, which is on article review process. And so I'll ask you to do this, but I'll start from Carly this time, and we'll work our way up this time. So if you could speak again about and describe the review process, as well as the key elements of a publishable manuscript. So if you could just quickly let us know what this is like for you in your journal, that would be helpful. Carly, please.
Okay, so thank you so much. So like most journals, our articles go out to 2 peer reviewers. But when I started in this business, someone said to me, the most important moment in the life of an article is when the peer reviewers get chosen. And as an editor, your responsibility is ethical, political. This is it. This is the moment. And so I take choosing the peer reviewers very, very seriously. Some journals have a large editorial board. We heard Prof. Oheka speak. I know Africa, it's often the journal board who make initial decisions. For us, we have a young editorial board and located, it's a big continent. People are located in different places. And I will often ask my editorial board for advice. But I also, as an editor, spend a lot of time doing detective work on a topic. Reading through I started the bibliography. I look at who you've cited. And then from there, I begin to build who must be your peer reviewers. So there's a lot, editors put a lot of work into selecting peer reviewers. Let me see what else it is that you wanted me to talk about. And then when reviews come back, some reviewers, reviewers are like people. Some reviewers are very constructive, kind, thoughtful, generous. Some reviewers are monsters, a bit like some, supervisors, like some people we know, people, our colleagues, people in our home. So, some reviews are going to come in and they're going to be really unkind. Editors can redact those things. They can soften the tone. They can digest things a bit. And editors can also say, focus on reviewer 1. You can't do everything reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 says. You have to kind of select. So you can also write back to an editor to say, always using a very professional tone, thank you so much for the reviews. I wonder if we could have a conversation. I can see how I can easily do what reviewer 1 asks, however, reviewer 2, but don't write back and say, I am not responding to this. This I'm not dealing with. That's just not going to go anywhere. So keep your tone very professional. Address the editor by a title. Not hey Kajitan. No, keep everything really formal, because editors are also overloaded. Editors have to deal with all of the emotions that come from authors. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Carly, for that. I mean, we can't just say, hey, I'm not talking trash back to reviewer 2, right? No matter what reviewer 2 says, you have to, take your 2 deep breaths before you respond. I really like that. I'll come to Kajitan now.
Thank you. And yeah, I think, Carly has laid out so much, but yes, the human beings on the other side. I know sometimes it's we just say, oh, yeah, they just want to reject everything. They just, yeah, but they're human beings on that side, and we want to get out the papers out. So for African Studies Review, so the submission comes in. We have a managing editor who looks at the technical stuff. It's blind and everything. Then it comes to me. So I'm the first port of call, and for the most part, I give most articles the benefit of doubt. It's so obvious that this is not it. Like I open a paper and it's some statistical whatever, some statistical analysis over half of it. I know this is not for ASA membership, so I would decline it at that point. But for the most part, I tend to move most things to colleagues so that there is a more deliberative process. It's really trying to make sure that whatever decisions we make, come from a collective rather than just using some veto executive power. So at that moment, when everybody else reads it, and then so the comments then allow me to decide whether to reject it right away, or there's enough interest that people think this is interesting, let's send it out. Then we'll find, reviewers, like Kali mentioned, we also look at the bibliography to see the people in the field. Also, when colleagues are making comments on paper, sometimes they put suggestions like, oh, this paper is dealing with this topic, if she's available, Kali Kutia will be great, for this paper. So we also use those suggestions to find names. And the idea really was we try to ensure that our reviewer list, we've been very conscious about this lately, reflects, the diversity of the field. The fact that some of us work in North America, but also colleagues who work on the continents. And we all have a stake in the journal. So we want to make sure that we're drawing. We also want to make sure we're drawing from, across professional stages, not just fully senior, not also just fully junior, or if we can help it, we want to cut across that. And then, and sometimes there's a new category we've been working with, which is what we call reject and resubmit. It is when there's some promise. We can see some promise. But for instance, in fact, I just did one on Friday where the paper, there's some good material, some ethnographic piece in there that will be useful. But the challenge is that right now it's so much buried in citations and secondary literature. And we know if we send this out as it is, it will not go well. So we do what's called reject and resubmit, where we say, hey, we can't move this forward now, but here's a paragraph of comments from the editors. If you can look at it, make some changes, and then send it back to us, and we'll look at it again. And often when that comes back, they're in a good shape to send out to peer reviewers. So in terms of, so I've talked about the DEX reject, the reject and resubmit, and then the peer review. For our journal, when things go out to peer review, there's a high chance that we'll publish it. We send very few things out because there are 10 people. You have to convince most of 10 people. But if you can convince most of us and it goes out, most likely ends in a journal. If you do the things like Ali mentioned earlier, if you pay serious attention to the reviews when it comes back. I tell authors, I say, listen, when it comes in that day, don't do anything. Don't make any decision about it. Just look at it and put it away. Look at it away, because, there is that inclination to be defensive, and then you miss the opportunity to make the most of the review. So my suggestion is just put it away for a day or two, then come back to it and, take each point and mark it up. I had this advanced graduate student at Cornell who submitted a revise and resubmit recently, and it was amazing. They had a table, for each point, they have a point, and on the next column, they had what they did, and and another point, I'm not doing this, and this is why. It was long, meticulous. And when it came back, I didn't even want to read the paper. I'm like, someone who took the time and cared to do this. This paper is ready to go. Of course, I read the paper, I sent it back to the reviewers, but the work they did, they demonstrated that they've taken so think of the peer review as your critical interlocutors. that, you know, these are colleagues in the field. You have taken time with your work. It's a time to engage them. What is it about it? So it's less about, you know, I tell prospective authors, it's less about doing what I need to do to get published. I think that is the wrong, that is the wrong question to ask.
Yeah.
It's the fact that this paper will be in your name forever. And you want to be able to look at it in 10 years and say, oh, yes, I'm still proud of it. You know, there's some things I'm like, oh, did I write that? You know, did I? But at that moment, I was stuck as a graduate student in getting published. But now I'm like, oh my goodness, that's in my name. I want to hide them forever, but you can't. People still cite it. I'm like, don't cite it. Don't look at it. So, you know, to wrap up is to so think of them as interlocutors helping you to make the paper the best version it can be. And if you can think of it that way, I think it removes the burden of acceptance. Then you can really say, okay, this feedback is helpful. I want to do it. And this is not going to help me. And this is why. And communicate, you know, politely and clearly, you know, as Kali mentioned earlier. So yeah, so that is the process. And also, sometimes you get conflicting feedback. This is the point to engage with the editor of the journal to see what they're thinking. You can also, you know, some people work, you know, I used to be in a writing group before, you know, I got so busy. And then part of what we walk through, you know, reviewer comments. That's what we walk through, helping each other figure out what these reviewers are saying and what to do. So, you know, find trusted peers and mentors to share reviews with as well as you navigate them. But more importantly, think of it as an opportunity to improve your work and not trying to do everything, because you want to do everything to please the reviewer, you please nobody, and the paper gets as rejected. So think of it as an opportunity to improve the work. And then know that the human beings on the other side, really, at least the people that I know who are on this forum, they want to publish your work. You know, I've seen Kali move mountains to, you know, to get the work to get the work out there. People want to publish it. So really, yeah, don't forget that there are human beings on the other hand, you know, who wants the best for you as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for that tip of thinking about it as something that will carry your name, you know, long after the paper has been published, but also remembering that, you know, and there are so many reviewers I know who take a lot of time, you know, reviewing your work. So you may see, you know, that reviewer that sends a massive page of comments, you know, and then you are like, oh my God. But that tells you how much care and time they spend, you know, reading and doing your work. I'll now go back to Belinda. Hopefully Belinda's audio is resolved, and then she will weigh in on these two questions that we have asked, and then I'll come back to you, Ambriana. Belinda.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Fantastic.
Okay, good, finally. Can I quickly go through the first part and then do 1 and 2 together?
Yes.
Okay, so hi, after all that, I'm the coordinating editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies, which, as Sylvia said, is the journal of the Canadian Association of African Studies. I'll get right in. It's a broadly multidisciplinary African Studies journal, so we're more like African Studies Review than like African Affairs or Journal of African Cultural Studies, which is not to say that we publish just anything. And I think the important thing for CAAS, similar to African Studies Review, is that we wouldn't publish things that are so technical and narrowly disciplinary that they would work much better in a specialist journal. So the ones that we get most often that are desk rejected are, for example, quantitative economics. So the work needs to not just come from one of many disciplines, but it needs to be accessible to a multidisciplinary readership. So we want, you know, people beyond your narrow discipline to be able to understand and appreciate the article. As others have said, read the aims and scope. Ours are very general. I won't rehearse them here. The other important parts, I guess, is that they must present original research and analysis. So often another reason that we desk reject articles is because they're great and they're well written, but they're an interesting kind of essay. They're based on secondary sources. They don't present any original primary research, whether that's archival or interview-based or other kind of documentary or film or whatever. research. They don't contain enough original material, and they don't present an original argument. And that said, obviously, they must also be properly situated in the wider relevant literature. So your study of whatever female farmers in eastern Zimbabwe might be fascinating, but unless you put it in some kind of larger context of gender and agriculture and land or whatever, then again, it's too narrowly framed kind of geographically for us to consider it worth publishing in a journal like CAAS. This one maybe people didn't really cover other than in bits and pieces, but maybe just the trajectory to submission. If you are going to submit to any journal, choose the journal to target. And that should come really early on, right? Before you even write, and you might have a draft, but before you finalize the draft of your article that you want to submit. And make sure you know why you're sending it to that journal. So, I mean, CAAS is a bit of an odd creature, we'll be the first to admit, but we're the Canadian Journal of African Studies. So you don't have to be Canadian to submit to us, and you don't have to be based at a Canadian institution. And in fact, there doesn't have to be anything particularly relevant to Canada, other than you think that the Canadian African Studies community might be interested in the article. But some people have a really specific reason for sending something to CAAS. So recently I got a submission, for example, that says this work is written in tribute to a Canadian academic who pioneered this field. So that's something you might want to mention in a cover letter if that's relevant. Other people have said already, you know, read other articles in the journal. That's really important, so you know what kind of stuff the journal publishes. Read the instructions for authors. I know that's tedious, but that's important. And so by the time you kind of submit it, you know why you're sending it to us. And perhaps you can explain that in a cover letter, even though the cover letter is not essential. But if you do say, you know, I've read articles, I cite a lot of work from CAAS, it contributes to this particular debate that's already being developed in the journal. The journal is a leading area for discussion on whatever it might be. Recently, I guess sexualities is one where CAAS has a bit of a kind of long-standing reputation for publishing good work. Other journals do too, but think about why you're sending it to us. The review and rejection process. Others on the panel have mentioned this already, but really, you know, if you haven't done your homework, so if you haven't done the thinking about why you're sending it to us, you'll get a very quick desk reject. If it doesn't fit the aims and scope, so if it's, you know, quantitative economics that nobody outside economics will understand, you'll get a very quick desk reject from me. Other reasons, I mean, sometimes people send stuff that's not really a journal article. It's kind of journalistic, so it's nice and descriptive and well written, but doesn't really contribute to an academic debate. You can't just take a thesis chapter, for example, and pretend that that is a journal article, because it'll be missing some of the contextualization and framing that's required for a journal. We sometimes get papers that are way too long. We have a generous limit of 10,000 words. If your paper is 15,000 words long, you'll be rejected. And if it's only 5,000 words, you'll probably also be rejected because you can't say everything you need to say in that short word count. Poorly written, we get a lot of, you know, people seem to submit things because they think, oh, well, I'll submit this rather sloppy draft and hope to get some good feedback. Well, the feedback you'll get will be, this has been rejected, go away and write it properly and send it back when you have. So don't take shortcuts. Yeah, other reasons for kind of desk rejecting rather than sending it for reviewers is not making enough of an original contribution. It's not properly contextualized in the literature. And sometimes it is ethically questionable. I mean, there have been, as you all know, recent issues around ethics and publication. And I think as editors and reviewers and as authors, we're more and more sensitive to those kind of things. So people submitting fake data or information, people using kind of AI to generate parts of their paper, people who've engaged in kind of ethnographic or autoethnographic work that's kind of problematic and not adequately kind of explained in terms of how people went about it. So, I mean, all those are reasons why we might reject, desk reject, that is. I mean, other people on the panel have spoken to peer review already. So I won't go through the kind of process of peer review, but we're similar to others. We send it, send invitations out to multiple reviewers. We need at least 2 reviews to support an editorial decision, and papers can go through 2 or 3 or more rounds of review, particularly if you don't do what the reviewers kind of ask you to do. So it's a good idea when responding to decisions, even if it's a reject and resubmit, and you're kind of feeling unhappy and a bit down about it. I think, as Kajetan said, wait a bit, get over yourself, challenge the reviewers if necessary. I mean, people often ask this question: can you not do things that the reviewers recommend? And absolutely, as long as you've got good reason for not doing it. And just kind of, I couldn't be bothered isn't a good enough reason. But there are often reviewers who make requests that aren't reasonable, or that they hope you might be able to do, but you just can't. So, for example, if they think you need more data, but you finished your data collection and you don't have the money or the time or whatever to find more, and you just have to work with what you've got, you can say, well, I've got this, I think there's enough there, so sorry, I can't do more, but there it is. So you can explain to the editors and reviewers why you haven't been able to, or why you won't. You might have ideological differences and say, no, I don't want to do that, and you being narrow and positivist or whatever, and I want to take a different approach in this work. So you can stand up for yourself, but again, do that in an intellectually sound way. Never be arrogant or kind of dismissive of a reviewer, and just explain carefully why you're not doing what you're not going to do, but also explain what you have done. So that's where a kind of letter or a matrix, whatever, is really helpful to the editors, saying, here are all the ways in which I've addressed the reviewer's comments, and be specific. Reviewer 1 asked for this, reviewer 2 asked for that, and I've done this, I've done that, I haven't done that, I can't do that, I refuse to do that, but I hope you nevertheless think that the manuscript is improved and that the response to reviewers is sufficient. Yeah, I mean, I think the main things on those first 2, so I'll hand back to others, and then we can talk again if there's time about the post-acceptance stuff.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those the additional comments, and especially some of the the helpful suggestions in terms of taking step backs and coming back to looking at the reviews. And I think that that's been consistent throughout all of the process. I'll hand it over now to Ambrina, and then once we've wrapped up this section, we'll go to the article acceptance stage and publication after this. So Ambrina.
Thank you, Sylvia. So for African Affairs, when we receive a paper and have discussed it, there are 4 editors. We discuss each paper in online in conversations on our submission site. If we decide that the paper passes the kind of threshold for going out to review, then we will, between us, discuss some names of possible reviewers. But the lead editor on that particular paper will also do the sort of detective work that Carly was alluding to try and ascertain the best reviewers for that paper. And in doing that, we rely a lot on our own professional networks, our own professional knowledge of a field, our own expertise, and of course our own kind of institutional journal knowledge about reviewers and who we might use, and again we pay attention to trying to broaden that stable of reviewers and not always go back to the same people, to try and make sure that we have an opportunity to get as much kind of intellectual rigor in that process, bringing in new people and so on. And it's a good tip, and I was given this as a young legal academic early on in my career. It's always a good tip as an author that you might think about the first few footnotes in your paper, because those footnotes, the first 10, 15, are the ones that you could use quite strongly to signal to the editors who possible reviewers might be. It's in that bit of your opening ground clearing part of the paper where you might include footnotes where you're showing quite clearly who you're engaging with and what kinds of literatures. And it's there that we'll often go to say, who might suitable reviewers in this area be that we could approach. So be strategic as an author in your thinking about your citations. Those citations signal something. They don't just tell us about the intellectual direction of the paper. They actually tell us something about with whom you're engaging and who we might go to for their professional opinion of that paper. When at African Affairs, when the reviews come back to us, we have 2 or 3 reviews often on a paper. That process can be quite elongated for us because increasingly we're finding academic colleagues under significant pressure. This is additional work that they do on top of their day jobs. It's not paid labor, and it's very difficult to extract reviews from colleagues. And I know myself, I'm behind on the reviews that I myself am doing for other journals. So bear that in mind, because what that tells you as an author is that if you have got 2 or 3 good reviews, full reviews, someone has really invested their time in you. And a colleague once said to me very early on, again in my career, if you get 2 or 3 reviews on a paper, your foot is already in the door. You're really nearly there. So don't take offense at this stage and say, oh, I'm so insulted by what I'm being asked to do, I can't be bothered. Because actually if the journal is engaged with you sufficiently to get these reviews, and the reviews have engaged with you sufficiently to make suggestions, you're as close as you're ever going to get. And don't forget that most papers are receiving major revisions. That is not uncommon. I cannot remember now, actually, the last time. It's probably 10 years since I saw paper just accepted as is. This is astounding stuff. Just go for it. No revisions. That doesn't happen. The majority of our papers, all our papers now, if they're not rejected, are major revisions. So engage. What we do as a journal, and I think it's excellent practice, but it's exceptionally time-consuming for editors, is when we receive the reviews of your paper, we go through those reviews carefully, and we write an editor's introductory letter to the author, and we say, below you will find 3 reviews of your paper. The reviewers have all pointed to major revisions. We would like you to do the following: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10 points. And each of those points, we can often write 10 lines, 12 lines. Those papers take me, partly because I'm a slow coach, partly because I need to do that work carefully. It takes me 2 or 3 days to write that paper, to write that letter to you. So I open a document, I start the letter, I walk away from it, and I come back and I look at it and I think again, am I happy with this? Then I go away again, come back. So it takes 2 or 3 days of this reflecting on it, because what I'm trying to do in that letter to you is I'm trying to mediate the reviews. I'm trying to say what reviewer 1 is pointing to is significant weaknesses in your paper. You must do this. On the other hand, what reviewer 2 is saying is less important. Or reviewer 2 also agrees that there's this significant lack of empirical material, or that your conceptual framework is still a bit confused, etc. And I mediate it for you. So what I'm trying to send to you is a signal about what we really, really need you to do, and also a signal about what you could be less committed to doing. So that letter that we write is exceptionally important. That letter, after I've written it, that, bear in mind, this is 2 days of thinking about it, then goes to the other editors. They read it, and they will often say to me, or we will say to each other, I think point 2 could be strengthened. Actually, I'm less clear what you're saying in point 4, because I want the author to be very, very clear in what you're communicating. Could you change the way you phrased that? That bounces back and forth between us. And then when that letter is finally signed off and all 4 of us are happy, it goes to the author. So that's a bit of insight into the extent of the work that we do behind the scenes. So we don't just, it's not a sausage machine. It's really significant labor that goes into each paper, and care about how we communicate to you what it is we want. Now, what we expect in return is an author who really, really engages with those suggestions. If I say to you, this is major revisions, then take that seriously. Major revisions can take 3 or 6 months. If you send the paper back to me and I see it back in my queue in 2 weeks, I will be on notice that you have not done sufficient work. And I'm starting to reread your paper and think about whether to take the time of a reviewer to look at it again. And I'm on notice that chances are you have not done major work. And you're acting, it's a bit fly by night, and it's a bit, you're chancing your arm, and you're trying to get the paper through. It's really important at this point, and I must emphasize it. You need to do everything you can to get your paper to be the best paper it possibly can be. Your objective is not just to get any old paper published. And I know all of academia militates against this, because we're all in our careers in this speeded up time, and we're worrying about promotion, and worrying about getting through probation, and we're worried about having a stable of papers, and we're worried about our academic reputations, and we're all speeded up. Actually, what we need to learn to do, and it's very difficult, I know, and it's easy to say when you're at the more established part of your career, but I say to my colleagues all the time, we need to slow down, and we need to think, how can I make this piece the best piece it possibly can be, and how can I use the reviewers' comments to make sure that happens, and how can I use the journal's letter to me, which guides me in the best possible way to strengthen the paper, to make it the best it can be. If you do that in a way that's very superficial and you send it back too quickly, the chances are you haven't done that work. So take the time and sit with it. And sometimes you have to just sit with difficult criticisms. That's not to say that a reviewer can be rude to you or impolite to you. And if they are, the editors, in our case, the editors will not redact reviewers' comments, but we will say to our author, we do not agree with the tone being used by the reviewer. And believe me, I will write privately to the reviewer and say, I will not have you taking that tone with my authors. And I will probably not use that reviewer again, because I will not have that kind of practice at creeping in. But it's nonetheless difficult for an author. I know it's very difficult to see your work critiqued so extensively in a major revisions letter, but it is the result of a real engagement with your paper, and you need to see it in that light.
And especially also remember there's someone else that is reading your work. Often when we are writing, we are in our own heads and in our own thoughts. Things make so much sense. You see the brilliance, and then someone else reads it and they're just like, please, could we take a little bit of time? And I agree with you, the work that I've done on the 2 journals that I also sit on, some of it is that painstaking work of reading everything, trying to see, okay, what are these ideas and how can we support those ideas?
Exactly.
One other thing to remember from what all the editors have said here is that sometimes a journal might reject your work. It doesn't mean that other journals will reject your work. It might just mean that the particular group of editors at that time probably don't see the value of your work. And that is not a rejection of your own work, right? It's a rejection of a paper, of one single paper. And once you get over things, you can go back to that journal again. You never know. You might then publish the best read paper in that journal, and you can have a story to tell about your own group. So I think that those are the sort of things that are really important. Now we get to the last bit, the sweet part, when you get that, beautiful letter that says that, your paper has been received very well and it's going to be published. If, the editors can very briefly, maybe 2 minutes or less, talk about what that process is, and also include tips on how to increase the impact factor of your readership, because this has become very important in academia these days, and especially for those journals that are not open access. Some journals are open access, so it's a lot easier for people to get a hold of your papers to read. But if you could speak about that a little bit more, what happens when an article has finally been accepted in your journal? So I will start with Belinda, and then I'll go to Kajitan, Carly, and come back to Ambrina.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, okay. Still playing up. Don't know what it's doing. Maybe it's all the snow. So after acceptance,
Just a second, Belinda, just to let everybody know that I am sending a link to all of the journals that have been discussed here for people in this room, so that it's a quick click. So when you see this from me, this is what I've just done. Go ahead, Belinda.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, just, I guess, two aspects very quickly. There's a lot that happens between accept and publication, and authors are often unaware of that. So they, the thing's been accepted, and a week later, it's like, why is my article not out yet? It's like, okay, well, here's what happened. So CAAS, like the other editors here, is edited by a collective of editors. There's kind of 10 of us. So once the editor handling your paper has accepted it, it comes to me as coordinating editor and goes, ta-da, this article's been accepted to CAAS. I give it a quick read over just as a kind of quality control. I don't copy edit it, but if something jumps out at me as a glaring error or something missing, then I'll, sort that stuff out. And when I think it's okay, I'll send it to Taylor and Francis for production. So there's a production editor who's somebody employed by Taylor and Francis. I've never met them, but they handle all that stuff. So they find a copy editor, they send the article for copy editing, they send it to the typesetters, and once it's copy edited and typeset with pages and fancy fonts and everything, that's a proof, as you know, and then that proof gets sent both to the authors and to me as the coordinating editor. And both the author and me have to approve that proof before it gets published. And what I'm seeing more and more is more and more rounds of correction, because part of what the copy editors find is like missing references and just, stuff that should have been sorted out by the author. Like, I'm not going to do your homework and check your references. So if there are things in the text that aren't in your list of references, or things in the list of references that aren't in the text, the copy editors will pick that up and it'll come back to you for correction, and it wastes a whole lot of time. So that's another reason why, both at the initial submission stage and certainly when you're submitting what you think is your final manuscript that you want to be accepted, make sure that that stuff is all sorted out and it doesn't waste time. But it typically takes several weeks between acceptance and proof approval and getting it out into the world in corrected, approved form. Then also just briefly marketing. So we will market your article. I mean, it's in everybody's interest, not just yours as the author, but to make sure that article gets the widest readership. I mean, it's a hard-nosed financial reason, because the more people download the articles, the more royalties come to TNF and therefore to CAAS and therefore to CAAS. But obviously, we also just want people to read good African studies scholarship. So we want as many people as possible to read it and to know about it. So people aren't going to just stumble across it unless they're doing research in a similar area. So we will, tweet about things. Taylor and Francis will send emails to people about the latest content in CAAS, etc. But also you can market as an author, do some marketing yourself. So, make sure, so I'm getting some weird background stuff here. Make sure that you tweet about it. Make sure that you put it in your email signature. Make sure that you put it up on LinkedIn. Go, hey, look at this new article that I just had published. And those things work, and they demonstrably work. Believe me, Taylor and Francis does research to kind of, scrape the internet and see what's where. And there are alt metrics for journals. You can see how many times an article's been tweeted or retweeted about, etc. So don't just stop and say, oh, good, the article's published, that's the end of it. But help yourself by promoting it by whatever channels you can. And I guess the final thing is you can write a blog, for example, or an article for something like The Conversation or Africa as a Country, where you write about the topic of your article and say, here's all this interesting stuff. Oh, and by the way, here's the link to the article I just published on the subject. So yeah, do yourselves a favor. Don't think of it in financial terms. That's awful. I hate thinking about publishing in monetary terms, but get it out there and get your work to wider readership as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belinda, for that, and especially on the part of doing your own marketing. For that's become the thing that we all have to be savvy with. I'll come to you, Kajitan, now.
Yeah, thank you. I think the things Belinda said, they really apply across journals, and I want to make sure we have enough time to, for discussion. So I will be I just want to make 2 points. One is that when the paper comes back, Belinda mentioned production. When it comes back to you, you know, sometimes in the spirit, in euphoria over acceptance, we don't look carefully at the thing that comes back. That is really the final opportunity to mix, you know, that way you can make big changes or something. But it's when after the copy editing, when it's at the proof stage or it's been published, you know, it can really change things. So you want to take the advantage to make that final corrections, any necessary to make sure that you catch every problem. Most problems, I think the substantial ones at the copy editing stage. And I would definitely, you know, again, you know the audience for the paper, so please, you know, do well to publicize it. And also seize the opportunity of the abstract. The abstract really can become something that helps with the search engines when people find things. So you want to ensure that the right keywords, you know, are in the abstract of the paper, so it can be picked up, you know, when people are searching and things like that. So yeah, I will leave it at that. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, so Carly and Brina, maybe if there are other things that haven't been discussed, otherwise we can go to the Q&A where people may have other questions that we can pick up.
I just wanted to make one final remark, if I may, that there's a difference between an article that is good enough and an article that is shaping the field. And if an editor, after acceptance, asks you to do another round of revision, it is because they want you to move it along from good enough to important. You want your article to become the source that people have to cite when they're writing on a topic. And that extra layer of care, it's like Prof. Eka said about the abstract. The abstract isn't just like a version of the first paragraph. That final layer of care is really, really important. So don't be too hasty.
Thank you.
Sylvia, if I may just add exactly Carly's point, when you have a paper accepted, in fact, that is not the sweet end of things. It's in a way the beginning, because at that point we know that it has passed the threshold, it's past the review stage, and you have a good paper that's publishable. But as editors, all four of us want to make sure that it's the best paper it can possibly be. So at African Affairs, we go through something like 3 or 4 further rounds of edits. In other words, by the time that paper actually sees the light of day in proof stage, every single editor has worked on it again. So we do all our own copy editing. So I will go through the paper as soon as it's been accepted. I will go through my bundle of papers, just as all the other editors are going through theirs. And I will quite often say, hold on a minute, you're writing about the Kenyan Constitution, but you're not citing, the correct article of the Constitution or the correct chapter of the Constitution. You're not citing X author who we would expect to see cited, even though it's been through review. It's almost like another layer of review being done internally by the editors. It will then be revised by the author, and then it will come back to me, and I will send it to my fellow editor, and they will go through it. And that happens twice, if not 3 times, so that at every stage we're lifting the paper. So actually, the paper you finally have published is quite a different thing to the paper that was accepted. And you should expect to see that difference. That is part of the service that we provide as a good journal. If we just took your paper and went, great, well done, lovely, off you go, bank it, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. So we take that additional work very seriously indeed. And that's important for our authors. The final tip I'll give to authors is that the evidence coming to us from our publisher, from Oxford University Press, is that the primary way in which papers are now found is not, the old-fashioned way that I learned to do research, which is to go into the databases and you find the paper by topic. It is now by Google search. And that is the reality of how academic work happens now. So your title needs to be Googleable, or whatever the word is. In other words, one of the last things I will do with an author is say, hold on a minute now, this convoluted title is never going to result in your article being found. And believe me, I am the queen of convoluted titles. I look back over papers I wrote in my 20s and I think, oh, no wonder no one ever read them. They just need a nice, clear, reasonably boring article. title. If the paper is about the Constitution in Kenya, just use those words in the title, get it in. It's not particularly sexy, but it needs to be Googleable, it needs to be searchable, it needs to be found by your readers. So do that work right to the end, making sure your paper is the best it can possibly be, and then making sure it finds its readers.
Okay. That's a fantastic note to end on, because I do know someone, I shall not mention their name, that has very creative titles, so, but then this is really good advice in terms of what is Googleable and what, we can sell, of course. So I'll now open the floor for all of your questions and your comments and, other contributions as well from others who are in the room. There may be other editors in the room or people who have tips to give to the people. So the floor is now open for questions. You can raise your hand, type them in the chat, type them privately to us if you'd like. I'll start with the first question in the chat while we scan the room for other people who may have questions later. First question here is, word limit is mostly a guidance, or is it a hard cutoff in your journal? So the question on word limit, and then reviewer 2, add this and add that. Elaborate on this. Is this missing? Should you add a new section? Even after, I think this is a very important question, because sometimes you craft your article is 8,000 words, and then reviewer 2 says, how about this whole section, which is another 2,000 words. So what happens in that particular case? So I'll start with Belinda. I'll go to Carly, Kajitan, and Ambrina again.
Sure. And I hope you can still hear me. Yeah, good. So it is, well, it's kind of hard. It's hard-ish, that limit. I think what's important in that question is, you said reviewer 1 asked me to add this, reviewer 2 asked me to add that. That probably means something can go. It also means you have to be ruthlessly efficient yourself and say, okay, they want me to add stuff. That's going to take 3,000 words. That's going to take me to 11,000 or whatever. What can I take out? I mean, at paragraph level, at section level, there's often a lot of superfluous stuff in an article that doesn't absolutely have to be there, or that can be there much more efficiently in terms of word count than it is. This is particularly the case when people are cutting and pasting from a longer thing like a thesis. Okay, you have to be much more efficient with your use of words in a journal article with a word limit than you can in a dissertation. So think about both of those things. What can go out in terms of sections or paragraphs or even words, that narrative, say it as efficiently as you can. And for everything that comes in, all the words added, try and take some words out. And the stuff you do add, again, add as efficiently and cleanly and simply. Part of writing clearly, rather than, what some people imagine to be academic writing, is writing in as few words as possible and not padding with overcomplicated terms and so on. So there are ways in which you can add material, but also subtract material to make the whole thing stronger and fuller, if you like. When we have a generous word limit, it's 10,000 words. We have occasionally published articles longer than that, but you have to have a very, very, very good case for why it needs to be longer. It basically has to be impossible to do what the article needs to do in fewer than 10,000 words. So there are exceptions, but they're very rare. And normally, if they come in too long, we'll just desk reject them. If I get a 13,000 word article, I'll just go out. It's like, go away, make this 10,000 words, and then we'll come back to it. So yeah, it is hard-ish with exceptions, but take it as a hard word limit and try and make your writing better to fit it within that word limit.
Kajitan, is there a way to negotiate this?
So I think it comes down to, what Belinda is saying. For every addition you're making, there may be a part that could be condensed, If it's a little over, I think it's fine, If it's 10,500 words, I think, we can, so we're fully online now. So I'm not a stickler for the word limit as I was in the past. So 10,500, yes, probably let it go through. But I think, the idea is not just to keep the article as it is and just add to it when you get a chance to revise. So I would say, there's always something you can tinker with, to some section that can go with the new addition or can be condensed, to bring things And ultimately, too, it's also a place where you have a conversation with your editor. If you're really doing everything possible and it's not happening, you can have a conversation with your editor. Kali made a distinction between good enough and important. Sometimes it's an important article. The editor may say, fine, I don't want to compromise what you have right now. We'll take it as it is. So depending on the journal. So yes, I have to do your best. And then if it's still not good enough, I will communicate with the editor of the journal.
Great, thanks. Carly and Ambrina, do you have anything to add before we get to the next?
I think we've reached the word limit.
except maybe to emphasize, Carly, that this is so much a judgment call, right? So see it holistically. I would say if you're writing 7,800 words, that paper is slightly short of where it should be. It's hard to say everything, meaning, it's hard to have a really robust argument in 7,800 words, just to take the asker's comment there in the chat box. If you're creeping above 10,000, then you've got flab and you need to cut that flab out. So it's about, really, it's hard to do as an author, reading every single word of your paper and thinking, is every single word pulling its weight here? And if not, rethink. Can I put this more succinctly? Can I, it's a discipline. Writing 10,000 words is a discipline. If you're creeping above that, maybe you need to be writing a book. Maybe an article form is not for you. Think again. If you're writing 7,800, are your ideas as fully developed as they might be in order to now submit this paper? So the word limit, I mean, in the way the word limit is a throwback to the days when we published hard copies and we were paying by page. Now that we're all online, it matters less, but still the discipline of that number actually does a job for you. It tells you something about the robustness and the direction of your paper.
And while we're waiting for other questions to come, to come up, I can't see everyone in the room, so I'm pretending that while I'm buying time so that Grace and the other technical person can help me sort out other people whose hands have been raised. I do have a question, that I struggle with, despite the fact that I'm now on, I've seen the other side of things as an editor, and I'm still also an author who sometimes. Part of this is, how do you write? Do you have, advice on how people can write concisely, in a way that one idea fits in one paper? Because I'm one of those people that can write different types of ideas. You have multiple arguments, but it all makes sense to me. And for me as a sociologist, I like to see this part of it and that part of it. So if you have any advice in terms of how people can curtail and or contain themselves in terms of writing more simply, and that leads to the second question. More and more we are seeing, people reading more creative writing, which is, I have to say, a little bit more appealing. And even as an editor, when I receive some of those papers, I'm like, oh, this is luxurious reading. I like to read these things. But then at the end of the day, I'm just like, oh, well, I can't make a head and tail of this, even though I enjoy reading it. And, especially with this generation of scholars who I think are seeing that more of those kinds of beautiful writing is great. And they read that, they read, a lot of the more established scholars who can afford to write luxuriously are writing in this way. And then we are asking people to just go to, introduction, boring argument, blah, blah, blah. So what is the advice you have, or what kinds of pieces of tips do you have for people who are writing, maybe at different stages of their career, but mostly early career grad students who are trying to get published and get a hang on publications? Anyone? Maybe I'll start with Carly. The word limit on this has not been reached, so.
Yeah, so I have to say I have a low tolerance at the journal for the kind of verbose, like the epistemic dichotomy of the dialectical, like, no, what to say it. And one of the things that I often say is, imagine a reader in Cairo who is of a different discipline. She has to be able to make sense of this. We have differently located readers. And sometimes the way people write, you can see it comes from an intellectual tradition. I won't call them out now, but I can tell where people were trained sometimes by the kind of the shade of purple that their prose is. But it's better always to write in a more accessible. You want your article to be accessible rather than to be a performance. It's a kind of chess game. You know, you have to hear the rules. Here we comply, here we resist. You comply to make it readable so that other people can access it.
That's a great point. It reminds me of soccer. And since AFCON is on now, it's not so much about how beautiful your dribbling is. It is about the fact that you can actually
Yeah.
Washington.
Yeah, yeah, I think, as and I'm open to debate about this. The experimental writing, I think belongs more in books. I think the book form offer a more, if it offers a more elaborate platform. Again, this will depend on discipline too. But I find that sometimes, those kind of work often fails at the level of the article. But ultimately, everything depends on who is doing what and what they are doing with it. So that's what, so, we wouldn't say, no, don't send us anything of that nature, but ultimately it's the achievement of it. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to see what is this contributing. Because sometimes like, yeah, this is a beautiful story. What is the uptake for this? What is the significance? And in terms of your earlier question about your first question about writing itself, then I think one thing to mention is that that initial draft is not your article. That initial draft is not your article. It's to know that this is just the beginning. There is a process that I often do, less so now, but I used to do earlier on. When I completed a piece, I'm like, okay, what is my thesis for this paper? And then I go back to each paragraph and I say, so what is the topic sentence? And I bring it out. So I'm trying to write a paragraph or a page that is the thesis of the article, and then the topic sentence for each paragraph. And sometimes I'm like, wait a minute, this topic sentence doesn't connect to the thesis of this argument. And I know I'm going on tangent there, and I move it, either I can adjust it to fit what the paper is about, or I have to move it elsewhere. So it's something that is worth doing. This is your thesis. When you're done with a draft, your thesis statement, then it's okay, for each paragraph, what is your topic sentence? Just put it underneath the thesis and do that until the end of the paper. And then you go back and say, this supporting paragraph, do they support the thesis? Do they advance their argument? You find out sometimes, in my case, that, okay, I'm like, this, I've moved on to something else. So, you may need, then that probably needs to go elsewhere, not in that paper. So that kind of exercise, can help to streamline one's thoughts and arguments into one piece. But writing, again, it's a process, and as we all know, always is also important not to work in isolation as a scholar and writer. You have to find a trusted community that you can share work with, and they can provide a soundboard, let them be the peer reviewer before the official peer reviewers look at the work.
Yeah, I will read out some more questions so that, since we don't have time, and if I may beg everybody's indulgence to add another 10 minutes to this call. I know that people have to leave. If you have to, please go. But what should one consider before submitting a paper to a journal? I think we touched on this a little bit more, but I think they are asking, whereas have similar editorial policies and possibly same editors. That's interesting. Can you request for a retraction of your paper? This is an important one, of your paper that has already been published online if you notice a citation error or simply because you no longer agree with the journal's editorial policy? Now that is interesting. If not, how can you successfully do damage control for suspected plagiarized citations? Claudine Gay comes to mind here. I wonder if this person might be more interested in speaking to this if people don't get the reference. Could you recommend Africa-focused journals that are more focused on publishing papers based on methodologies and field work experiences in Africa? Thank you. Quite loaded, but 3 questions that are so. So maybe who hasn't spoken? So Ambrina and then Belinda.
Okay, so I can have a go at that first one, because to be honest, I'm not at all sure about question 2. I would always bounce that question to the publisher. That's not something for editors to make a decision about. That would just go to our publisher, and then they would follow whatever protocols they have, and we would not really have to be too concerned with that. So, for example, if you have a request about reprinting your paper somewhere in an edited collection, or some kind of technical question like that, that goes to the publisher. That's not one for the editors. You can send it to the editors by all means, but we then pass that kind of thing on. So just to be clear what the editor's remit is. On that first question, if your second preferred journal has got the same editorial kind of group or the same editorial policies, what that suggests is you're probably going to end up with a similar rejection. Yeah, you want to go somewhere a bit different, and you certainly don't want the same editors, and that shouldn't really be happening. We shouldn't be editors on very closely related journals like that anyway. But if they are, then it suggests that you're probably cruising for a bruising. So look for a journal that's quite different. But I would say that if you get an R&R from a journal, as I said earlier, you're already most of the way there. So stay in play with that journal. If, on the other hand, you decide, I really can't take the reviews, I really don't want to make these changes to my articles, as a matter of principle, I want to go elsewhere, by all means, go elsewhere. But think about what nuggets of actually really good advice exist in the reviews you already have, and do the work to improve the paper as best you can before you send it to another journal. In other words, don't send it to Journal A, get reviews, decide against them, and submit to paper B. Do some work in between, because anything that you do on your paper is strengthening it and making it more likely to pass review, and just making it a better paper. So any feedback you get is always to your benefit. And I would always advise, keep that idea of working on your paper as a kind of continuous process very much in your mind.
Belinda?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever, support everything that Brina said. So I won't go over that stuff again. The retraction, I'm not quite sure what's underlying that. You can ask for a correction or a corrigendum, and they will publish that. But once it's published online, that's the version of record, and it's very difficult to get that retracted. I mean, it will be retracted by the journal if the journal finds out, or by the publisher, that it's been plagiarized, or there's been other unethical conduct. I mean, there was a notorious example in a journal for which I'm on the board, Gender, Place and Culture, that retracted an article that was basically completely fraudulent and had been published and submitted to try and show the journal up, you know. So yeah, things do get retracted, but you can request, if it's something as minor as a minor area in your data or a minor area of citation, then you can just ask that a correction be published, and it will be published as a correction. So there'll just be a little thing for this paper, you know, please replace this with that and ignore the other. It doesn't happen often, but you can do it. And then your next question, Africa-focused journals. I mean, I'm not sure specifically, but I think, Brina, if I'm correct, African Affairs publishes methodological pieces. CAAS publishes something called research notes, which can be either kind of preliminary findings that you haven't written up yet, or kind of methodological reflections on fieldwork or other research activity. So I mean, no journals come to mind immediately, but the journals represented here do publish those kinds of pieces.
Great, thanks. Carly, do you have anything to add before I get to the next question?
No.
Yeah, I like the summary of that. There's a question. I work on travel writing, and I discovered an interesting unpublished manuscript.
I answered that one on in private.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, that author and I have had a conversation now.
Okay, that's fantastic. I suppose we've answered those questions. I did see a hand up earlier, but that hand has disappeared. All right, are there other questions? Okay, so the
hand back up.
Yeah.
Yes, hello, the hand is back. First of all, thank you very much for your contribution. It's very informative and interesting for me. I have, well, I'm not sure how much time we have because this might be quite controversial topic, but I wanted to ask your, as editor's, point of view on that. In particular, the role of artificial intelligence and tools like ChatGPT in academic writing. Have you discussed this within your editorial boards, and what do you think that the future holds as for artificial intelligence in academic writing, and the policy your journals might have towards it, or maybe you have already implemented them? Thank you.
Great question. So I will start with Carly on that one.
No idea what the future is going to be. I did, for the first time 2 weeks ago, put a very purple, densely written prose abstract through a ChatGPT and asked it to simplify, and what came out was very good. And then a friend of mine and I set our essay questions for ChatGPT, and again, what came out was very good. So it's scary what's coming for us. I don't know.
Yeah. Kajetan? Belinda and Ambrina. Oh, sorry, Kajetan, go ahead.
No, I really, we've not taken a position on this in the journal, but ultimately, the question of research integrity remains paramount, and we will not compromise. Any work being submitted, we expect that any work being submitted, is the work of the author. So I think that remains a standard that we continue to hold our submissions to at the moment. Yeah, but I think
Yeah. Belinda and then Ambrina for the last word.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, and obviously AI is advancing very rapidly. But it does, I mean, some of the stuff when it writes, when AI written, whatever the term is, that'll be picked up in plagiarism checking software, because it's basically taken stuff from a lot of different sources and put them together often, rather than writing from scratch, although I realize that that's changing. But sometimes you'll be able to pick it up through that means, and submissions do all get sent through plagiarism checking software that'll pick up even short, phrases and show you which published sources those have been taken from. So that's one way, inadequate as it is, that those things might be picked up. Another way, I think, increasingly publishers and submission platforms are going to be asking, can you guarantee that this is all your own work and wasn't generated by ChatGPT or whatever? I mean, that's leaving it up to the author to say that it was. But also, I mean, there's no reason, I think, why you shouldn't use AI to do some of the kind of boring stuff, although it doesn't apply as much in African studies. But if it's a very standard laboratory technique or whatever, that it may as well be written by a robot, then frankly, let the robot write it rather than waste, your time, and keep your brilliant scientific mind for the kind of analytical bits. It is, well, both an opportunity and a challenge. That's such a cliche, I realize. But publishers and journal editors are certainly aware of it, if not quite sure what to do about it yet. But yeah, expect to be asked when you're submitting, is this all your own work or was part of it generated by AI?
Okay, great, thanks. Ambrina, the final word.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, as far as I know, counted a ChatGPT type thing submission at the journal, but I have had actually just this morning my first student essay written by ChatGPT, and I was amazed by how quickly I spotted it. But the interesting thing is that the plagiarism software doesn't show any problem, so it's only 3%, on Turnitin, so that didn't raise any alarms. But what raised an alarm for me was that it was at once brilliantly written and also rubbish. So it was brilliantly written because it was exceptionally fluent, and it looked like, this was a second year student, this was written by an academic. So it had that language that you just think, having encountered the student in class, I doubt it. Just bear in mind, this is only for a draft paper, it's not anonymized, so I had that advantage. But also, the paper made no real argument. There was no development of an argument through it. It was an accession followed by an accession followed by an accession. they clearly typed in the names of 2 or 3 key authors on legal pluralism, and this had just generated this stuff, and it was just the same point made in 3 different ways, but there was no progression of an argument as you would expect to see in a paper. So it was very easy to spot, and we now have to, you know, take a position on it as a law school. There is a school of thought amongst academics that, you know, we need to be smart about, particularly with our students, teaching them how to use what could be a very powerful research tool. So, you know, I'm not completely, as Belinda says, I can see where the savings by coming in, where, you know, if you were smart, you could use this technology. I suspect that if a paper came to us as a journal, we again would be able to spot a paper that was entirely generated without any mediation or intervention by an author. We would be able to spot that. If the paper has been then worked up, worked on, worked with, then at what point does it cross from being a ChatGPT paper to being the paper of an author? And then, you know, it goes through its normal review process. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm fully expecting it will. And I think, you know, I think it's here to stay, and we, all of us, need to be reasonably smart about how we respond to it.
Right. And on that note of, you know, what the future holds for us, I'd like to thank all of you, especially our panelists, for their very insightful comments on how to get published. Just as a way of recap, know your audience, do your research on the journal before you send your paper in, because every journal states very clearly what their aims and objectives are. So do that work. Be strategic in your choices in terms of your citations, because then that is who you are in conversation with, and most likely the kinds of people who will be reviewing your work. Also engage with reviewer comments, even for reviewer 2, no matter how difficult it might be. Step back when you see your reviews. Don't be too afraid of them. And remember also that, you know, the person at the end of that review is a person who's taken their time to review and read your work. So engage with them, as well as with the editors. Like the panelists have said, you don't have to address everything that a reviewer has asked you to address, but you do have to respond to the editors about why and how you are doing this kind of a review. Remember always, it is not personal, despite how it might feel. It is not personal. And think about your legacy, right? Your name on that paper in another 5 years. So it's not really just a, you know, the thing about rushing it through publication. And one other important tip that Kajetan has given is to try not to work in isolation. Academia in itself is isolating enough, but writing a paper sometimes can be a beautiful collaborative process if you find people who can be supportive and give you feedback. Remember to keep working at it, keep working on it. Do not be discouraged, but above all, also keep it simple. Go back to the basics. Find Googleable titles. On that note, I'd like to say again, thank you so much for coming. And before we close, I'd like to pass it on to the president of the Canadian Association of African Studies, Dr. Grace Adeniyi Ogunyankin, to give us a final word of thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's kind of hard to follow up. I just want to say I gave you an A+ on your note taking. It's exactly the same as I have. The only little edit I like to make is get over yourself, were the exact words that were used in terms of, you know, when you get the reviews. And I really like, I just want to stress the point that Kajetan made about writing group. I actually never thought of getting into a writing group to go over the reviewers' comments. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea, but that's not the point of this. I just want to thank all of you, including the audience member, for showing up, because if you didn't show up, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. Thank you so much to Embrina, Belinda, Kajetan, Carly, who, when I first reached out to them in August, they said yes, without a doubt. It was a bit harder to find a time, but we did. And shout out to Carly and Embrina, especially, who are hours ahead of us and right now, for still showing up. And thank you, Sylvia, my very good friend. Thanks for not talking about jollof for the first time. Thanks for agreeing to moderate this panel. And yeah, I'm going to not, you know, stretch our time any further, and just say thank you to everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, and of course, Femi, thank you so much as ever for, supporting us. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.